In the name of the God who created us, in the name of the Christ who teaches us, in the name of the Spirit who journeys alongside us, welcome home, children of God. Welcome to First Presbyterian Church this morning as we gather online as God's people in God's name. Once again, we are sharing worship from our homes, but we are united together in spirit. And I am so grateful to be a part of this community. I cannot tell you how uplifting it is to me each Sunday when we all check in, for me to see everyone's names scroll by and picture each one of your faces. Speaking of checking in, please remember to do that again this morning. As a church, we have committed to give $1 for every person who worships with us each Sunday to a different local or national ministry. And since today is the fourth Sunday of April, our Everyone Counts offering will go to Living Waters for the World. This is a program run by the Presbyterian Church Synod of the Living Waters. It fills Tennessee, Kentucky, Alabama, and Mississippi. And Living Waters installs water filtration systems in homes and communities without access to clean, potable water. There are now over 1,000 of these systems installed around the world, including over 24 in East Tennessee. So please let us know that you are here worshiping with us this morning so we know how much to send to Living Waters for the World. And as always, please know that your presence with us today makes a real and tangible difference in the lives of people in our communities and around the world. And I also ask humbly that you please continue to remember the church in your own giving as you are able. Later in the worship service, you'll find a link on the screen where you can make a contribution online or an address where you can mail a check. We are struggling with decreased contributions like many churches right now, but we are grateful for your support of your church as we strive to keep our commitments to ministries in the church and in the larger community. And you'll find the weekly prayer list in your e-newsletter each Thursday. But I also want to ask that you please keep the family and the friends of Tony Hedrick in your prayers. He passed away about a week ago and will be dearly missed by our church family. And finally, I want to remind you that even though many businesses in Tennessee will begin opening back up later this week, The session has decided to keep our church closed at least through May 15th. And whenever we do resume in-person worship, though, please know that we will continue to broadcast our worship services live, just like we were doing before the lockdown. And you can find all of our past worship services archived on our YouTube channel. Just search for First Presbyterian Church, Elizabethton. Or better yet, make sure you click the subscribe button right now to join our YouTube channel. Beloved in Christ, today is a day that God has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it as we worship together.
Today's call to worship is from Matthew 11, verses 28 through 29. Come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls.
Christians try to sing, Hallelujah, Amen. Oh, praise to Christ our King. Hallelujah, Amen. Let all with heart and voice before His throne rejoice, praise in His gracious choice. Praise yet our Christ again. Hallelujah, amen. Life shall not end in strain. On heaven's joyful shore, His goodness will adore, singing forevermore. Hallelujah, amen.
Good morning. For our practice today, we'll be focusing on our breath and using a method called Tonglen to connect with the heartbreak and many, many emotions that surround us and often fill us. So find your body position that lets you find stillness, helps you find stillness. And you have the option of focusing on the image. It's a strong tradition in the Sufi practice. Or closing your eyes as we begin. No particular breath today, just breathing in and out as it's comfortable for you. And the Tonglen method uses the idea that we breathe in the suffering and breathe out the remedy. No particular words or format. But as we've all experienced loss this week, losing Tony, let's breathe in loss. And breathe out the remedy, love, peace, comfort, whatever flows easily from your heart. And as we breathe in loss, we're also touching all of those who've lost loved ones. And breathing out our gift, love, peace, standing by. One more time, breathing in loss, breathing out love, sweet memories, kindness. And now as you breathe in whatever comes to your mind. Breathing out the remedy. It might be anxiety, or fear. There's no need to hurry. Take your time. We're standing together in solidarity with our brothers and sisters who may feel the same way. Transforming that suffering in our hearts and sending back peace, goodwill, love, smiles. No suffering is too small, no remedy insignificant. Breathe with that same suffering until you feel some relief. And see what's waiting next. And as we close, see the faces of our brothers and sisters, the nurses, the doctors, the patients, those who are in harm's way, those who are ill. Let the stress and disease melt away and see them whole, healthy, and happy. May all beings be well. May all beings be happy. Peace, peace, peace. Amen.
Names of heaven as I go through this wilderness below. Guide my feet in peaceful ways. Turn my midnights into days. When in the darkness I will grow, faith always sees a star of hope, and through life's all of grief and danger, I shall be free someday. Burdens now may crush me down, disappointments, they're all around. Trouble speaks through mournful sigh, sorrow through a tear-stained eye. There is a land where pleasure reigns, no mourning the soul shall roam its plains, and soon from all life's grief and dangers we shall be free someday. I do not know nor what will be, nor what the future may hold for me. But this I know, with Jesus leading me, I shall go home someday. I do not know nor what will be, nor what the future may hold for me. But this I know, this I know, this I know, where Jesus leading me, I shall go home, I shall go home, I shall go home someday.
Our reading this morning comes from 1 Kings. It picks up on the story of the prophet Elijah shortly after he had been victorious in a battle against some warriors of Baal. But instead of being able to celebrate his victory, things did not go as expected for Elijah, and he ended up finding himself in a dark place, all alone. So our reading begins in chapter 19. King Ahab told Queen Jezebel, all the things that Elijah the prophet had done, how he had defeated the warriors of Baal. Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah with a warning. Said, "May the gods do whatever they want to me, if by this time tomorrow I haven't slain you, just as you did to the warriors of Baal." Elijah was terrified. He got up and he ran for his life. He arrived at Beersheba in Judah and left his assistant there. Then Elijah continued on alone another day's journey into the desert. When he could go no further, he finally sat down under a solitary broom bush. He longed for his own death. He prayed to God, saying, "This is more than I can bear, Lord. Take my life from me, for I cannot go on like this any longer." Then Elijah lay down and slept under the solitary broom bush. Suddenly a messenger of God tapped Elijah and said to him, "Get up, eat something." Elijah opened his eyes and he saw flatbread baked on glowing coals and a jar of water right by his head. So he ate and he drank, and then he went back to sleep. The Lord's messenger returned a second time and tapped Elijah. "Get up," the messenger said. "Eat something, because you have a difficult road ahead of you." Elijah got up, ate and drank, and went refreshed by that food for 40 days and nights until he arrived at Horeb, God's mountain. There he went into a cave and spent the night. The Lord's word came to him and said, "Why are you here, Elijah?" Elijah replied, "I have done all that God has commanded, but I can do no more. I am all alone, and now I fear for my life as well." The Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is passing by." And a very strong wind tore through the mountains and broke apart the very stones around Elijah. But the Lord wasn't in the wind. After the wind there was a mighty earthquake, but the Lord wasn't in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire. The Lord wasn't in the fire. And after the fire there was a sound, thin, quiet, barely a whisper. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his coat. He went out and stood at the cave's entrance, and there, in the silence, God spoke to him. My very first preaching class in seminary, we used a book by Fred Craddock. It was entitled, surprisingly enough, Preaching. Fred was born and raised in rural Tennessee, graduating from Johnson Bible College in 1950. He spent most of his career as a minister at Cherry Log Christian Church, a small rural church in North Georgia. He died in 2015, but a few years before that, I got to hear him speak to a group of clergy. And he stepped up into the podium, I remember that day, and he started talking about how he was a little discombobulated from nearly being in a traffic accident on his way there. And he told us in great detail about the near miss with another driver who wasn't paying attention, the truck that swerved behind him, and somehow, in the midst of his story, I realized I was listening to a sermon. For years, Craddock was listed among the best preachers in the English language. He was amazing to listen to and probably had more influence on my own preaching style than anyone else I have ever read or heard. Mostly what I learned from him was to just preach my own experience and hope that others could find something in common. From that insight came my own realization that I should be reading the stories of the Bible the same way, not looking for sweeping theological declarations about God, but just as a window into the very personal experiences of the writers, as they too struggled to make sense of events in their own lives, especially events that very often challenged easy theological answers. been rereading a collection of Craddock's sermons during quarantine, in part looking for inspiration about how to preach during these unusual times, and also in part just to find comfort in his own stories of finding inspiration and holiness in simple experiences in life. One of his sermons in particular has stuck with me this week. In it, he is describing the diversity of his congregation. Some people, he says, show up to work or to worship every week, come to every Bible study. They're making deposits into their faith account so that when crisis hits, they can write a check that will sustain them. Others, he said, don't worry about that. They say, whatever comes, I can handle it. They don't yet know that they can't. As it turns out, pandemic is not one of those things that we can just shrug off. While the loss of life could certainly be much worse, were it not for dedicated healthcare professionals, community leaders, and essential people in our food supply chain, it has still been significant. Beyond the illness itself, many people in our communities, including some in our own church family, have lost their jobs or faced significant pay cuts. Many others have seen savings evaporate overnight. The scope of loss we have encountered and continue to face leaves us in shock. I chose a reading from 1 Kings this morning. The prophet Elijah, who was considered the greatest of all the prophets in Israel, Elijah has just had his moment of triumph. He had just played his best card, won his biggest battle, but it wasn't enough. It was followed by a blunt death threat from Queen Jezebel. And we know that she had both the will and the means to carry out such threats. So Elijah felt like he put in everything he had, all his resources, all his energy, into the challenge facing him. And when he was exhausted and spent, turns out that nothing had changed. That realization plunged Elijah into depression, and he fled for his life. And this time he went south into the region of Judah. He journeyed until he couldn't walk another step, until he was physically and emotionally exhausted. And he sat down under a tree, and he asked to die. Enough, he said. I'm done. This is more than I can take. Elijah had been depositing into his faith account all his life, and he still couldn't handle what faced him. Elijah's story is one that I imagine resonates with many of us, at least sometimes in these past difficult weeks. I know it does with me. And there are a couple of things I notice about this passage. First, when Elijah breaks down, the first thing God does is to give Elijah food and rest. That simple recipe is a huge part of grace in crisis. Simple, practical care. Eat and sleep. If you're in shock, if you're overwhelmed by the losses you are facing, eat and sleep. And I don't mean to gloss over how difficult those two simple acts may be. For all those facing job loss or pay cuts across the country, food security can certainly be an issue. And even for those who are not, supply chains for many food items still haven't caught up with demand. And sleep. Sleep seems to be elusive for many of us these days. I have a weekly check-in with my clergy group, and every single one of us reports difficulty sleeping. I seriously doubt that's a malady that is only afflicting middle-aged Presbyterian clergy these days. I know that rest and food don't always come easily, but they are both important to managing stress, and they are critical to maintaining the physical and emotional resilience that we need not only to sustain ourselves through difficult times, but also to recover and to help others as well. In the Elijah story, it is a messenger from God, an angel who shows up with food for the prophet. Even in these challenging times, we have angels at every step of the food supply chain who put themselves in danger every day to help keep us fed. We have angels in the healthcare system, in emergency management, in food pantries, and even in our neighborhoods who are all helping to provide both food and safe places to rest for millions of people. As challenging as these times are, they would be far, far worse without these angels of grace meeting simple needs. These jobs, these tasks are important. They matter. They make a difference. And they all depend on people all too often overlooked. Another thing I notice in the story is that God just sends Elijah back into the thick of things with a stack of instructions. It's almost like God just brushes aside all of Elijah's despair, though I think there's more to it than that. First, Elijah experiences God, though, but in a very particular way. He's up there on the mountaintop waiting for God to pass by. And there are all these traditional signs, all these signs that are supposed to accompany an encounter with God. But all of them pass by, and God's not in them. The earthquake, the storm, these are all things that normally accompany the presence of God, accompany an encounter with God, but they all pass by for Elijah, leaving nothing afterwards but the sound of sheer silence. Have you ever desperately looked for God and encountered nothing but, well, nothing? But this void, this silence, this is what turns out to be a holy moment for Elijah. There's a story from early on in the civil rights movement of Martin Luther King, Jr. He's awake one night late when the phone rang at his home. It was another death threat. Unable to sleep, he made a cup of coffee and sat in his kitchen. I can't do it, he said to himself, to God. I'm not strong enough. Alone in the silence, every now and again, we scrape to the bottom of our souls and find ourselves lacking. But there in the kitchen, in the dark, in the silence, in the emptiness, God gave Martin strength and sent him back to the struggle. I don't know how, he said, but from that moment on, I never looked back. I think Elijah and MLK both remind us that it's okay to not be okay. That it's okay to be scared or anxious or nervous about a very unknown and potentially frightening future. They both went through a very emotionally and spiritually dark time. But there's one more thing that is buried in the story, too. It's part of the instructions given to Elijah. It turned out there were a lot more pieces in motion than Elijah could see. In the story, there are political undercurrents that Elijah doesn't know about. Later on in the chapter, it turns out there are some 7,000 other people who are working toward the same goal as Elijah. But Elijah didn't know about any of them. And even though he felt completely alone, completely isolated, he was not truly alone. Physical and social isolation is difficult for all of us, even for us introverts. and having to stay in our homes and not interact with friends, with co-workers, with strangers, that all leaves us feeling alone. So I think maybe that's the piece I find most helpful right now. As alone as I feel, as lonely as this struggle is for all of us, we are still part of a global community. Elijah felt wholly and completely alone, but he wasn't. You may feel wholly and completely alone. I know I do sometimes. But we're all in this together. That doesn't mean that we don't have a part to do. Taking care of yourself is important in this fight. Staying vigilant about our own health so that we don't spread disease to others is a critical part of this global endeavor. But when your resource bank is empty, when your own resilience is low, remember that we often find God in community. We often encounter messengers of God in unlikely places. And I believe that if we look with open eyes, we will see God at work in the midst of this crisis, in the thousands, millions of people who continue to look out for others in small and large ways. We are not truly alone, and we will make it through this together. And hopefully with a renewed sense of unity and purpose that reorients our priorities back to the dignity and welfare of every person and of the planet that we all inhabit. COVID has illuminated very clearly the reality that we are all in this together. And if you find your own faith has been pared down to nothing, if everything around you seems like empty silence, may you, like Elijah, find that the emptiness and silence have been full of God all along. Amen. Shall we pray? God, sometimes we find ourselves in a place where we desperately need a word of encouragement, but instead find only silence. In those times, help us to see the messengers of God, the angels who surround us, friends, family members, restaurant and grocery store workers, healthcare workers, unseen and unknown people who all play an integral part in our own well-being. But even more than that, when we find ourselves despairing, help us to remember that even small, simple acts on our part might also be helping someone else in ways we don't see. We all long for a peaceful kingdom where all your children are safe and are fed. Help us to trust that our small acts help to make that vision a reality, even if we can't see it. Use our energy and our gifts in ways that help others to see the presence of God around them. Amen. Beloved in Christ, continue this day in the reassurance that God is present in the people and the creation around us, even when all we hear is silence. And know that our actions, our presence, may also be the way that God is bringing hope to someone else. So don't neglect even the tiniest act of hope when you have the opportunity. And now, beloved, in whatever this week holds for you, may the road rise up to meet you. May the wind blow always at your back. May the sun shine warm upon your face. May the rain fall softly on your fields. And until we meet again, may God hold you in the hollow of her hand. Amen.
O